Hello, I'm Daniel Orama, and I'm excited that you've joined me today on Points to Ponder. Points to Ponder is a podcast that explores discipleship, music, and worship. It also examines the political arena, music, and ideologies that affect the Christian church. The podcast aims to give listeners thoughtful insights and reflections on these topics from the Word of God. If this is your first time here or visiting again, grab a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, and let's journey together on Points to Ponder. Well, hello everyone. Thank you again for joining me for another episode 3 of Points to Ponder with Orama. Yes. So, and guess what? Of course. Yes, I do have my cup of coffee right near me. I just love coffee. So grab coffee or tea, and we're going to get at it. Now today, before we begin, let me just say, if you have not listened to episodes 1 and 2, well, I highly suggest that you go back and listen to those episodes so you can be up to speed with what we're going to be covering today. Each of these episodes actually correlate with another. So these are not just random teachings that we're going to be going through today or in the future. Also, if you have not listened to the About Me podcast, the very, very first one, well, I would suggest that you go back and learn a little bit more about me and what it is and why it is I'm talking about these things that we are covering in these podcasts. Now, today, we're going to be covering something a little different. We're going to be covering about and talking about some core concepts. Core concepts. What do you mean by that? Well, there's key concepts to better understanding the opposition of worship in the Christian church in Cuba, which are rooted in the fact that the regime proclaimed itself a communist, Marxist-Leninist, and atheist society. If you've been following along, we have been talking about the phenomenological effects of Fidel Castro's revolution on the Christian church in Cuba. That's why it would be good for you to go back if you haven't listened to those previous episodes. Now, according to author Peter Lamas, he says, and I quote, that the saddest thing for me about Cuba is its atheism. It's not just a case of church and state being separate. It is official state policy that there is no God, end quote. That does sound familiar in some of the teachings that we're finding today within our public school education when we talk about evolution. Evolution declares that there is no God. Atheism declares that there is no God. That is the same thing that you find within the communist regimes. Communist regimes, and speaking of that, of Cuba, they disbelieve in the existence of God. And guess what? Their whole education system is built on that premise. The education system contradicts the teachings found in the Bible while claiming that there are no contradictions between Christianity and socialism and Marxism and so forth. Well, in our public school system, and I did mention that we were going to start finding out some similarities of what happened in Cuba as to what is transpiring today in America. Now, of course, evolution has been taught for a very long time within the public school education, which again denies the existence of God, which is and contradicts the teachings found in the Holy Bible. So that is the same thing that the communist regime, what they have proclaimed over the years, that they themselves do not believe, of course, that the Bible is the Word of God or that there is any existence of God. And in the previous episode, I had mentioned that found in a textbook for 10-year-olds, they said that Jesus never existed because science had already proven that. Well, of course, they gave us no more information about that. In any event, we have, again, as I'm talking about, quoting Peter Lamas, and I quote, he says, "Where do the contradictions between Christian teachings and socialist teachings lie?" This is, of course, talking about what Fidel Castro had said. Well, a contradiction found between biblical Christian teaching is that, number one, socialism is against the whole of the family, which they say creates class inequality. Well, not for nothing, that statement alone just created class inequality. Another crucial concept that we're going to be looking at too is that there's the issues of the concerns that church properties that the Cuban government took over. For example, you mean they really took over some church properties? Absolutely. Not only did they take over church properties, but they also confiscated all private school properties. But here's an example. The Maranatha Church in Cuba, which has requested a permit to construct a larger facility several times because the current one is full. However, J.C. Derrick's article reveals that, and I quote, Cuban authorities have refused to grant the permit and have announced that they are seizing the property that has belonged to the Eastern Baptist Convention since 1947. Again, hands and money that were used to have this property or build the property is no longer theirs. It was stolen, taken away. Now, additionally, the Maranatha Church would need to pay rent to the Cuban Communist government if they wanted to continue using the building. Yeah, you heard that one, right? They would have to pay rent to the Cuban Communist government if they wanted to continue using the building. Oh no, that's not far-fetched. I've had family members tell me the same thing, that the houses they once owned, they did not own anymore, and they actually they wanted to stay, they had to pay rent. How would you feel about that one? I mentioned in a previous episode, that my uncle had a seamstress business, dry cleaning business, and when the communist takeover took hold in Cuba, they boarded up businesses, his being one of them, and they would not allow him to go back or open up the business. And unfortunately, 9 months later, he died. He died of a broken heart. I can only imagine what he must have felt like. So this is the things that the communist regime were doing. And then on top of that, Derrick reports that former President Barack Obama told Congress he plans to remove Cuba from the list of state sponsors of terrorism, and I end quote. So when Obama was in office, several Republicans, though, pushed back on the idea and quickly acted to create a bill that would block such a move by the Obama administration. Now, one would ponder who was the actual occupier. The one who stole the church? That's something to ponder. Another critical concept is how Castro attempted to confuse Christianity with Marxist socialism. Yeah, by giving examples of how Jesus was for the poor and destitute. Really? Okay. So the realization is that the two have no commonality for a person who does not believe there is no God. Well, Dennis P. Petrie writes that one pastor and his wife refused to send their children to a public school, arguing that the state system emphasizes a Marxist-Leninist atheist ideology that contradicts their beliefs. And I end quote. Well, there's a contradiction right there. So it's obvious that Christianity and Marxism and socialism, there are definitely contradictions between the two. And number one, you cannot override the Word of God. So over 5 generations, think about this though. Over 5 generations have been indoctrinated within Cuba's public education system, teaching that there is no God. In the United States public education system, you're not even allowed to name or say the word of Jesus in the public education, in the classroom. You can't talk about God. Why is that? What are you so afraid of? That's the point. The point is that not that there is no God. The point is that you are afraid of Jesus Christ. That is the one whom you fear, and you should, if you are still claiming that he never existed or that there is no God. So a person had the right of conscience, though, to believe that there was a God. Now, we're not going to talk about God. We're not going to talk about Jesus. But it's okay for you to in your conscience, believe that there is a God. But any attempts to mobilize on that belief, to take outside of the church walls or the home, guess what? We're subject to being arrested. You get where I'm going with this. Coexistence only survives underfoot by the communist government of Cuba. So a church can be boarded up and close instantly, very simply. And like I mentioned, it's a true story that my uncle had his own dry cleaning seamstress business, and when Fidel and his henchmen took over Cuba with violence, because they did, they boarded up his business, and he was not allowed to go there or open up. And we're gonna be talking about this whole idea about violence because it is within the Communist Manifesto and Marxism. And like I mentioned, he died 9 months later of a broken heart. Now the question that I have is, who's going to take responsibility for this action? I thought so. Who's going to take responsibility for that? To this day, no one has been held accountable. And he's not the only one. There are countless others that lost their lives, were arrested, had to leave, were exiled. Remember, the day you leave this earth, you will be held accountable by the Almighty, whether you believe He exists or not. It does not matter. You will be held accountable. I mentioned about the Communist Manifesto and Marxism. To fully comprehend the origins and motivation behind Marxism, it's going to be crucial for us to understand its historical context. So in the early 1920s, Marxist ideology gained traction in Latin America. Now, why is it that everyone keeps using the Spanish people as a go-between? This is interesting also, because even in America today, the second largest population group is the Spanish population. But it seems like both sides are using the Spanish population for their own agendas. My mother worked 2 to 3 jobs most of her life. I remember her going to these different jobs just to be able to stay afloat. She worked hard. She came to this country in political asylum. She did the right thing. She became an American citizen. And she worked very hard for her family. Now what I see is the Spanish people have become the middle class of culture that is repeatedly put asunder. But what we see is that Marxist ideology gained this traction in Latin America, and it became a driving force behind revolutionary efforts to achieve liberation and social change. Liberation? There is no freedom without Christ. And the freedom that we have in America, as Ronald Reagan said, is just, it is one generation away from being extinct. And note that evolution won over in the United States in 1925. Why do I bring that up? Because it shares the same ideology as Marxism, that there is no God. Cuba played a pivotal role in the development of Marxism with this guy named Carlos Balino. He was emerging as a key figure in promoting its principles. According to author Isabel Monal, and I quote, "The early initiator and promoter of Marxism on Cuban soil was the laborer Carlos Balino, 1848 through 1926, who had become a Marxist, get ready for this, who had become a Marxist, I'm still in the quote, during his long stay in the United States." Wow. Became a Marxist during his long stay in the United States. Did that just sink in, and are you taking a moment to ponder that? he became a Marxist in the United States, which tells you something about what has been going on in the United States for many, many years. Now, don't misunderstand me. The United States is an amazing country. The ideals that we're striving for freedom and equality for all people, for success and prosperity for all people, to love one another and to be a good neighbor, those are the ideologies of the United States. Regardless of who may have marred what it really stands for, those are the ideologies that my mother came over here for. So this guy, Baliño, becomes a Marxist, and he brings back this ideology to his own country. It's similar to the story in one way about the Ethiopian eunuch who found salvation in Jesus Christ, and what he did was he went to his country with that news. Not for nothing, but ponder a while on the fact, again, that this guy Baliño became a Marxist in the United States. Baliño expressed ideas that were clearly socialist and Marxist. Again, quoting Monal, these included belief that social phenomena, as I'm in the quote here, that social phenomena follow laws and that social struggles are influenced by significant forces within society. End quote. Baliño argued that Cuba needed a revolutionary uprising, oh, here it comes, to overthrow capitalism and establish a new culture where the working class would hold political power. First, the working class do not and will not hold political power because Fidel and his regime are the ones that hold the power. They just make you think you have the power. And then you're just working for the greater good. You are now common to the core. And this is true about all countries that live under a communist rule. They live under the political power of the leaders while the people are just mere peasants supporting the greater good. It doesn't matter who agrees and who does not agree with what is being said. But to gain support for this cause, Baliño collaborated with Jose Marti. And we're going to get into who Jose Marti at a later podcast, where we will be dedicating a whole entire podcast on who that person was. Now, he was another revolutionary to reach out to Cuban workers in Tampa and Key West, Florida. Wow. So who's the occupier now? Now, according to Monal, quote, Baliño joined Marti in his efforts to obtain support from the Cuban workers, especially the tobacco workers in Tampa and Key West, Florida, end quote. One reason for this collaboration was Baliño's concern that the United States posed a growing imperialist threat to Cuba. Wait a minute. The greater threat was Baliño and Marti treading the landscape of the United States with an ideology that vehemently opposes the Constitution of the United States. Carlos Baliño and Jose Marti played a vital role in this historical development of Marxism in Cuba, and it's still entrenched to this day. Marxism, as we're still talking about this, it's a revolutionary communist ideology that emphasizes the working class, yeah, right, and in enforcing government rule. Well, there you go. But the working class thinks that they're the ones enforcing government rule. Think about this for a second. The moment you step out of line of what the government enforces, the rules that they enforce, I don't mean like if you murder someone or steal things. I'm talking about just opposing some of their ideology. You're gone. And they'll hold you in bondage because they'll take away everything. How do I know that? You say, Daniel, how do you know that? Well, when I went on a missions trip to Cuba, I met family there for the very first time. And there was 4 family members. And I invited them to come to church. We were there on a humanitarian missions trip. We had brought over lots of musical equipment that we would give to the churches because their musical equipment was falling apart. Saxophones were pitted. The drums, the skins of the drums were ripped. If the communist government really cared about people in the church, they would have helped. They would have helped them with all of these problems that they were having with their musical instruments and so forth, and deteriorating buildings and whatnot. But they were not. What they wanted to do was crush Christianity. But remember, Jesus said that the gates of hell will never prevail against it. So no man, no woman, no government will ever be able to prevail in the end against his church. So now, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, they introduced it in their manifesto of the Communist Party. The founders depicted society's history in this document as a series of class struggles. What they did was they argued that capitalism is a profoundly exploitive system. What do you think you're doing to the working class when you tell them that now you can't own your own business, you can't own anything, you can't even go and use your gifts that God has given you to be able to bless others in your community? You have to then be just common to the core, get a job, and work for the greater good. That's a profoundly exploitive system. But this is what they say about capitalism. They argue that capitalism is a profoundly exploitive system. And according to their theory, the working class will overthrow the ruling bourgeoisie class through a revolution and establish the dictatorship of the proletariat. Did you just get that? The working class is going to overthrow the bourgeoisie class, so another class of people, through a revolution. Really? People get hurt in revolutions. That's why I don't like to use the word revolution when people say, oh, we need a revolution. Be careful when you use that word, because people always get hurt in a revolution. People die in revolutions. I know people say, well, we need a revolution of love. Well, that doesn't always work out so great. So they want to establish this dictatorship of a working class. The government wants to put in a dictatorship. How do we know? Look what they did in Cuba. Why are you so passionate about this whole thing with Cuba? Because my parents are from there. It's close to home. So now getting back to what I was saying, so I met 4 family members. And I was inviting them to church. And what they said was yes. 3 of the 4 said yes, but the one that couldn't, she said no. I can't. With tears welling up in her eyes, she's like, I can't. I'm like, why not? Because I work for the communist government. If they find out that I step foot in this church, or in any church, I risk losing everything. Wow. I risk losing everything, she said. That's the working class now that's in control. You have profoundly exploited your dictatorship upon the people. You have forgotten the poor. You live like kings and queens while the peasants live as what you call them. For the greater good, for the greater self. I mean, one has to easily question whether establishing a dictatorship of a particular group exploits the people to cement the government's agenda. As I previously mentioned, and I quote, "Following that, the workers' state will abolish capitalism, build socialism, and establish communism, a classless society of material abundance and stateless self-administration." That comes exactly from the Communist Manifesto. Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels. I got to read that again and think about the United States now. What's going on here? Quote, "Following that, the workers' state will abolish capitalism, build socialism, and eventually establish communism, a classless society of material abundance and stateless self-administration." Wow. If you think about this for a moment, they've been chipping away at the wall of capitalism in America. Don't get me wrong, and you know who you are. Many of you have exploited and you have abused your power under the capitalism system. But a classless society stripped of their God-given talents to serve the community for the greater good dictated by the ruling government. There are people within our own government today that praised Fidel, namely Bernie Sanders. And when the so-called squad recently went on a hush visit to Cuba, one has to ask, why? It'd be in the best interest of this podcast also to include a brief explanation of atheism and its beliefs. Many atheists believe that religions and gods are products of human imagination. However, there are different opinions among atheists on how they are to approach religion. Some view religion as a harmful social perception that must be eliminated because of the threat of mere human invention. Listen to what author Dylan Evans says here, and I quote, "All atheists agree that religions are human creations and gods mere figments of the imagination." End quote. Fidel quickly instituted a public school education that God does not exist because science had proven otherwise. Of course, no supporting facts were given. Do you notice I try to, at least if I say something, I try to give you some sort of documentation, support of what I'm saying here. Not because I'm great, but because I know that it's important that if someone says something, well, that God does not exist because science had proven otherwise, you better show some support of that. Religious groups, well, they're seen by the Cuban regime as a potential threat due to their networks and resources that transcend borders and their disapproval of communism. Of course, we disapprove of communism. As a result, listen to this, in 1961, and I quote, "In 1961, the new Cuban government declared itself officially atheist and implemented a militantly anti-religious policy." And I'm quoting there Dennis Petrie again. Furthermore, in 1975, listen to this, the 1975 Constitution made it unlawful to oppose the revolution based on religious beliefs. What? A Cuban who is in the communist regime that receives the salvation of Jesus Christ is in danger. That's why my family member, you notice I'm not saying her name. Of course not. You know I can't do that yet. Why do I say yet? Because there's going to come a day and a time that Cuba will be free. She was in danger of losing everything if she entered, even stepped foot in a church. Because as I continue the quote here, consequences for that individual and family members can be severe. End quote. Quoting Dennis Petrie again. Marxism, communism, and biblical Christianity are not the same. The contradictions are evident by Fidel's admittance of atheism. A young boy in a small town in Cuba, I'll never forget this scene, walking into his, like a stone home, inside and out, concrete everywhere. And I remember we were singing, and we were singing some worship songs in Espanol, of course. And yes, eventually I'm going to be making these podcasts in Spanish. I'll keep you updated on that. But I remember this he couldn't have been more than 12 years old. And this kid was sobbing. I mean, a deep, deep sobbing. Because I knew he was being touched by God. And I could see he yearned to know who this God of the Bible is. Not just God of the Bible, but God of all. And maybe, just maybe, some of that sobbing could be because he can't share that with anyone outside of his home. Because if he does, his family will be arrested, the home will be taken away. And honestly, not to offend and not to sound mean or anything, but it wasn't much of a home in the sense of what it looked like. But it was a home filled of the Holy Spirit. My hope is that you take some time to ponder these thoughts. This is not to glorify the terrible things that are in the world, or to heart pluck your strings, so to speak. These are real things that take place. And unless we know that they're happening, how are we ever going to be able to respond? Because a lot of these things are happening here in our own country, in our own midst. Just because we live in America does not mean we're exempt from this. So I pray that you'll take some time to ponder these thoughts. And if you're not someone who normally does that, well, then I challenge you to do so. And then ask yourself and ask the Lord what it is that you can do to help others in your reach. God bless, and I'll see you next week.